So now I want to talk about the limitations of comparing SOL across time and space. So I know your notes, actually about 80% of the chapter 5.1 notes are just about this lah. And also more or less the entirety of the chapter 5.1 lecture was about this. So I am just going to hopefully go through the concepts themselves relatively quickly. And I hope by copying down what I'm writing here, you will be able to better organize your notes. Because the problem, right, there's actually a lot of repeated or recyclable points when you're talking about the limitations of comparing SOL across time and across space. And 其实很少他们会要你写一整个 essay just about this. Okay? Most of the time, everything in this section will just be evaluative points. Okay? Which is also why I have no idea why most of the notes are on this lah, because honestly they have better things to test you than just about limitations for an entire 10 or 15 mark essay. Okay, so let's get started. Remember I said this earlier when we are changing indicators from GDP to real GDP and real GDP per capita, right? What are the two limitations that we are trying to address here? So if I'm moving from GDP to a so-called better indicator of real GDP, right? This means that I'm trying to overcome the limitation that sometimes there might be changes in general price level of an economy over time. So I've talked about Zimbabwe earlier, right? That's because if you just look in terms of nominal GDP, due to the ease of obtaining such data, and actually because of this ease, a lot of data that will be given to you, even in CSQ, is going to be in terms of nominal GDP. Okay, but this is misleading because if the country is experiencing a very high rate of inflation, this means that nominal GDP is going to increase very, very fast. But the purchasing power of consumers may not, because naturally we will explore later on in chapter 6.3 how it is that high inflation erodes the purchasing power of consumers. But naturally, high inflation will increase nominal GDP. But if inflation rises at a higher rate than wages, then of course that is going to decrease your purchasing power. Real GDP is what happens when you account for changes in GPL by actually measuring with respect to constant base year prices. So the solution to this, when I move from GDP to real GDP, is to measure with respect to certain base year prices. Can? So, normally in CSQ, assume that any GDP data given to you is in nominal terms unless otherwise stated. Okay? If it is in real terms, they will explicitly tell you real GDP or just GDP with respect to some year's prices, then that's when you know it's real GDP. If not, assume that it is nominal unless they explicitly tell you otherwise. Can? So, why do I need to go from real GDP to real GDP per capita? Because remember, this per capita is divided by population size. So the limitation that this change in indicator is trying to overcome is the fact that you may have changes in size of the country's population over time. Okay, so as a result, you may either overstate or understate the material SOL if you don't take into account population growth. So in general, I think I said this verbally earlier, but let me just write down. I will use mathematical notation, hopefully you understand. Basically, if the rate of change of the population or the rate of population growth, as long as it is less than the rate of growth of real GDP, then this will mean that GDP per capita is going to be increasing over time. Okay, you understand my math notation, right? If I write it out in math, you understand, right? Fantastic. So yeah, I just thought that maybe explaining it verbally, you might not have caught it, you might not have copied it properly. I hope writing it out like that helps you understand. Can? Okay, yeah, we are done with the limitations of comparing SOL across time. Now for across space, the one that your HCI lecture notes actually span about, hang on, I have the notes in front of me. How many pages do they span? From halfway through chapter 16 all the way until the end of chapter 18. Yeah, 2.5 pages is just about talking about this. So I'm going to summarize it for you. Okay, because not every country will measure and publish their real GDP or even real GDP per capita with respect to the USD. I'm not sure about Singapore. I don't recall, but most countries they will definitely publish and measure their real GDP per capita in terms of their local currency, their domestic currency. So naturally, because every country uses a different currency with a different value to com- to measure their GDP, a major problem arises because it is difficult to compare the GDP of different countries because there's no common basis for comparison. So if normally, as we know, we use the USD as a common currency or common basis of comparison to measure the value of all other currencies in the world. Okay, and later on we will explore in chapter 6.7.3 that the US actually has a uh, it actually does not manage its interest rate. It allows its interest rate to exchange rate, I'm sorry. So the value of the US dollar is allowed to fluctuate freely because a fixed US dollar would naturally not be very beneficial for the global economy if everybody is trying to measure uh their currency with respect to the US dollar. I think that sentence might have sounded a bit paradoxical, but you will understand what I mean when you learn about exchange rate policy and how the exchange rate is determined by free market forces of demand and supply. Okay, so just KIV that for now. Forget what I just said. Don't copy it if you found it confusing. Don't copy anything that you don't understand. Okay? If I'm saying anything that you do not understand, please just don't copy. Okay? So, yes, as I just said, it's standard practice to use the US dollar as the common currency to measure GDP because you need to convert it to USD. But in order to convert it to USD, the problem is what do you need to convert a currency to another currency? You need an exchange rate, right? And the problem with exchange rates are that they are fluctuating. As I said, you will appreciate more in chapter 7.3 how an exchange rate, right, is just a measure of the value of a currency with respect to another currency, or in this case, with respect to the USD. And exchange rates are actually quite free floating because, right, they are determined by free market forces of demand and supply. I think even though you only learn this in chapter 7.3, it will be good to just draw the DDSS diagram now. Let's say I'm talking about I want to convert SGD to USD, right? Let's say I want, please don't write this in the space. I don't think I gave you that much space. You can just copy this on a side note if you want, or you can just not copy it. This is just to illustrate, okay? Anyway, you are talking about the price of SGD in with respect to the US dollar and then the quantity of SGD. Let's say initially my demand and supply for SGD are as follows. Okay, let's say for whatever reason, now suddenly because of something that happened, you will learn all about the somethings that can happen later on in macro economics. Suddenly US investors have a very, very high willingness and ability to buy Singapore currency and assets. This means that the demand for our currency will increase from D0 to D1. So I'm not going to label the quantity because I trust you know how to draw a DDSS diagram. If you don't, frankly, why on earth are you here? Okay? Yeah, so I'm just here to illustrate the price, okay? This means that if my value of the SGD with respect to the USD increases from P0 to P1, this means that my exchange rate is going to, we say that the exchange rate appreciates or depreciates. Okay, so as you can see, because exchange rates are determined by free market forces of demand and supply, and even though we've learned a lot in micro about government intervention, the government usually tries very hard not to intervene in the market for currencies in the foreign exchange market because, well, ultimately it is okay. There are private investors who buy and sell currency now, of course, but usually the bulk of changes in demand and supply come from governments buying and selling the domestic currency, trading their domestic currency for foreign currencies, and running up and down on their reserves. But I think I'm confusing you because you will only truly appreciate what I'm saying after studying chapter 7.3. If you can hear the cat in the background, just ignore the cat, okay? Anyway, I have digressed a bit, but yes, you need to know that because market exchange rates can fluctuate, that is one. So the sub-limitation here is exchange rates or market exchange rates will fluctuate because of the demand and supply of currency. Okay? And the second one is that international comparisons of GDP based on exchange rates do not reflect differences in costs of living. That's why earlier on I talked about purchasing power, right? PPP. Because, for example, right, if I think this illustration is in your lecture notes, if let's say a McDonald's burger costs $6 in Singapore and let's say 3 USD in the US. Okay, then let's say I convert Sing dollar to USD. So I say that let's say um no hang on no okay, let's say I have an identical product. Okay, so I cost 6 Sing dollars in Singapore but 3 USD in America. This means that the difference between the purchasing power is 1 Sing dollar has the purchasing power of 50 US cents, right? Now, if that is indeed the exchange rate between the two currencies, then that is all well and good. But because of these fluctuations in exchange rate, the exchange rate may not be nicely 2 to 1. It may be that 1 Sing dollar can be exchanged for 0.83 or 0.85. I think that's about the current exchange rate now, about 0.8 something USD or 0.7 something USD. This means that this actually undervalues or understates the MSOL or the purchasing power of the country with a weaker currency. Because as you probably know, you go to JB a lot, right? Or Bangkok or Batam. You notice what's the thing? Malaysia's currency is weaker than ours, right? That's why one SGD you can exchange for a whopping 3 point something ringgit, which the Malaysians are really not happy about because it used to be 2 point something. Okay? So because of the currency is weaker there, that's why things there, to us who live in the country and who get paid in the stronger currency, if we buy goods and services in JB in the weaker currency, it's cheaper to us. Gets? Yeah. So because cost of living is lower there, but then if we don't take into account purchasing power parity, then we might think, how is it that the purchasing power of the ringgit is so much lower than that of the SGD? Does that mean that the SOL in Malaysia is lower? May not be, may just be, and in this case it is, the case that yes, they get paid in a weaker currency. The value of their paycheck is less than the value of your paycheck, the objective value with respect to the USD, that is. We don't use a gold standard anymore. So now the USD is the closest thing we have to an objective value of a currency. Okay, so yes, it is true that the Malaysian's paycheck is worth less objectively than your Singaporean paycheck. But then their SOL may be comparable or even higher than yours. Because yes, they get paid in things that have lesser value. But at the same time, their cost of living is also lower. That's why every time we go JB, we say, oh, so cheap, so cheap, cheap, cheap. Yeah, gets. Yeah, I hope you get what I mean. So I think just in the illustration, I hope I've summarized this entire thing for you. And now, in purple, I'm going to talk about some common points that you can use because these are limitations in comparing both across time and across space, okay? One is composition of national income. Now, what do I mean by this? What I mean, right, is, for example, let's say North Korea. I'll write this down, okay? Let's say North Korea has a real GDP per capita, okay? So I use per capita already, right? Of let's say 55,000 USD. And let's say the US has real GDP. Hang on, let's ask Google real quick. What is the real GDP per capita of the US? $70,000. Okay, let's say 70,000. I don't know what North Korea's is, and frankly, I'm not going to Google because I'll probably just be led to some state propaganda site. So let's just say it's 55K, right? So let's say in the US, the real GDP per capita is going to be 70,500 US dollars. So if we look at this, then we might say, hey, the average citizen in North Korea is not that much worse off than the average citizen in the US, why? Because it's not that much less. But we know on the ground that that's not the case. Why? Because when I talk about composition, what do I mean? I mean things like capital goods versus consumer goods. Okay? I said a bit about this previously, right? Earlier on when we were talking about the fact that MSOL is only consumer goods and services, right? So naturally, because North Korea, we know what is the bulk of their GDP. They produce a lot. The value of the things that they produce within the geographical boundaries of their economy is a lot of value. What are these goods? Things like missiles, military goods, all that. Are any of those available for consumption? No, right? So because so little of their national product is actually goods that can be consumed by people other than Kim Jong-un, that is why the average resident, the average citizen in North Korea actually does not have a very high MSOL. But these numbers alone do not reflect that. Understand? Second one, so far we've been talking a lot about MSOL, right? So far this is all MSOL. Next, we are going to look at the challenges or the limitations in comparing NMSOL across time and space. So NMSOL, we can always link to things like changes in the level of disamenities, or the other one is changes in negative externalities. I have no idea why the HCI lecture notes group negative externalities and disamenities differently, but okay, let me just change the headings because I like to use the terms disamenities and negative externalities interchangeably because purely by definition there is quite a bit of overlap. So I think your HCI lecture notes, if you look at page 21, they talk about negative externalities and then they talk about disamenities like working hours, stress, etc. separately. So this will change how you perceive NMSOL across time and space, right? Because if you look at national incomes alone, if you look at GDP alone, even if you overcome all the limitations on top, right, about challenges in comparing GDP across time, across space, and composition of national income, okay? If you can hear the cat, just ignore the cat. This only takes into account your MSOL. It may be, as I said earlier, let's say in order to increase my real GDP of Singapore, my workers need to work very hard, they are very stressed, they fall sick often, they are not happy with their lives. But then the data says, but they're earning a hell lot of money. Surely they should have a high SOL, right? Obviously not. So that's work hours, stress, etc. Then negative externalities, I also said using my example earlier, right? Earlier on, I told you that the problem is a lot of examples are too Singapore-centric, right? I managed to think in between that last recording and this one of a overseas example. You know in China, the Three Gorges Dam, think about it, right? It does contribute to the GDP of China because of the fact that with the dam, I'm not entirely I forgot what river the thing diverts are. But yeah, but basically the Three Gorges Dam, right? Naturally, it creates a lot of jobs to build, plan, maintain the dam, all that. Obviously, it has economic benefits because the diversion of the river makes life better for some people downstream or upstream. And then, obviously, on paper, when the Chinese government did the cost benefit analysis and decided to build this dam, obviously they must have decided that the numbers work out. The benefits of building this are indeed higher than the cost because of future increases in MSOL because of the dam. But then what is the trade-off in terms of NMSOL? You have to displace so many families. All the pollution, the damage to the earth that the construction of the dam is causing, because you pollute water sources, you pollute the river, some people downstream don't have clean water to drink, all that. But none of that is indicated in the numbers that the Chinese government is going to crunch, right? So all of that are all negative externalities. It constitutes an MEC, that is deadweight loss, societal, welfare laws to other third parties who may not have even wanted the dam built in the first place, who have no vested interest, who may not even stand to benefit from the building of the dam. But at the same time, they still need to suffer the negative externalities associated with building this dam. Okay? So naturally, depending on changes in negative externalities, work hour stress across time within the same country and also across space at the same time, but in different countries, then ceteris paribus, we can come to the conclusion that material SOL may increase according to the numbers, but NMSOL may or may not have increased. So a lot of time, whether in CSQ or in 15 mark essay, actually CSQ, sometimes they might give you a lot of CSQ data and then they say in the 8 mark or 10 mark, oh, discuss if the SOL of China is higher than that of South Korea, or discuss if the SOL of South Korea has improved from 2008 to 2018. Then you will, a lot of the times the data will obviously show you that MSOL has improved lah. Because if MSOL improve, then you can say R2. However, NMSOL may not have improved. But then if the data says MSOL decrease, then it's a bit hard to argue that NMSOL increase lah. So the relationship is always, if material SOL increases, there may be trade-offs in NMSOL because of that. Okay? Can? Understand? Fantastic. So this has been a bit of a long one. After this, I'm going to go on to the most important and exciting part. And in order to talk about economic growth, you will need to revise PPC and you will also need to draw the ADAS diagram. So for the next one on economic growth and its impacts on SOL, I'm going to approach it assuming that you are familiar with the ADAS framework. So if you are not already, please do familiarize yourself by at least looking through chapter 5.2 before going on to the next video.